Imagine it's the year 1340, and the sun has just dropped below the horizon in a small village. Outside, the wind is screaming at -20 degrees Celsius, but inside a tiny stone hut, the air is thick and sweltering. You aren't alone in the dark, you're squeezed onto a wooden platform with your grandparents, your siblings, and your parents. But here's the strange part. Just 2 feet below your bed, a 1,200-pound cow is chewing hay in the dark. In the middle of a medieval winter, privacy didn't exist because privacy was a death sentence. You didn't just keep your livestock nearby to protect them from wolves, you kept them inside to use them as biological space heaters. As the cow exhales huge clouds of warm breath, the temperature in the small room rises just enough to keep your blood flowing. The goats huddle against the stone walls, their body heat radiating upward toward your sleeping family. But then it gets worse. To keep that precious heat from escaping, every crack in the wall is stuffed with dried mud and straw, trapping the smell of animal waste and unwashed bodies inside with you. What happened next was a daily gamble for survival. If the fire in the center of the room went out, the living heater below you became your only hope. You would climb down from the platform and press your frozen hands directly against the cow's warm hide just to stop your fingers from turning black. In this world, the line between a human home and a stable didn't exist, because without the animals, the morning sun would rise on a house full of statues. Imagine walking into a medieval kitchen midwinter and seeing a pot that hasn't been emptied in a month. A mother stands over a heavy iron cauldron, gripping a charred wooden paddle as she scrapes the thick, bubbling sludge at the bottom. She isn't starting a fresh dinner, she's just adding to a liquid that has been simmering for weeks. She tosses in a handful of shriveled, dried peas and a slab of gray salt pork that's as hard as a rock. But here's the strange part. This perpetual stew was never meant to be finished. The fire under the tripod stays lit day and night, keeping the pottage at a constant, slow boil to kill off the rot. You might find a piece of cabbage from Tuesday mixed with a bone from 2 weeks ago. And then it gets worse. As the winter drags on and the food stores shrink, the soup gets thinner and grittier. The mother has to stir constantly because if the bottom burns, the entire village will smell the bitter smoke of their only food source ruining. What happened next was a desperate test of the stomach. To eat, you dip a hollowed-out loaf of stale bread into the pot, using it as a spoon to scoop up the warm mush. There are no fresh vegetables or bright flavors here, just a salty, brown broth designed to keep your heart beating until spring. It's not a meal. It's a survival strategy bubbling in a pot that never gets cleaned. This constant cycle of adding and eating was the only thing standing between a peasant family and starvation during the long, frozen months. Think about trying to do chores when the air is cold enough to freeze your breath instantly. A young woman kneels by a creek, her knees sinking into the slushy mud as she reaches into the black, rushing water. She isn't just rinsing a shirt, she is swinging a heavy wooden bat, smashing a thick wool tunic against a flat, icy stone to knock out the grime. Her hands are a deep, painful red, and steam rises from her skin as the freezing water splashes her face. But here's the strange part. She isn't worried about the water being wet, she's worried about it turning into glass. After wringing the wool with raw, shaking fingers, she tosses the garment over a hemp rope tied between 2 trees. Within seconds, the shirt begins to crackle. Instead of flapping in the wind, the tunic stiffens and hardens until it looks like a sheet of plywood. And then it gets worse. If she touches the frozen fabric with her bare skin, the ice can actually tear her flesh away. What happened next was a weird trick of physics called freeze-drying. She leaves the wooden clothes outside for days in the sub-zero air, waiting for the ice to turn directly into vapor without melting first. If she brings them inside too early, the melting ice will soak the dirt floor and turn her home into a damp, freezing swamp. In the Middle Ages, keeping clean wasn't about smelling good. It was a high-stakes gamble where one wrong move with a wet sleeve could leave you with hypothermia before the sun went down. As the sun dips below the horizon, the inside of a medieval cottage turns pitch black. A man kneels by the central hearth, using a small iron shovel to push gray ash over the last glowing orange embers. He isn't trying to extinguish the flames. He is carefully placing a heavy, bell-shaped ceramic cover called a couvre-feu over the mound. This device starves the fire of just enough oxygen to keep it sleeping but alive through the freezing night. But here's the strange part. If those embers die, his morning will be a nightmare. In a house damp with winter frost, striking a spark with flint and steel could take an hour of frantic striking and blowing until his lungs burn. And then it gets worse. If he can't get a spark to catch, he has to wrap himself in heavy furs and trek through knee-deep snow to his neighbor's hut. He isn't going there for food, he's going to beg for a single seed of fire. What happened next was a life-saving social ritual. The neighbor would use metal tongs to place a glowing coal into a small clay pot filled with insulation, handing it over like a piece of gold. The man then has to sprint back home, shielding the pot from the wind, because if that coal goes cold before he reaches his hearth, his family will be eating frozen pottage in a room that's minus 20 degrees Celsius. In the Middle Ages, fire wasn't something you just made, it was a living thing you had to babysit, borrow, and protect like your own child. Imagine a traveler sitting on a frozen log, desperately trying to keep his toes from snapping off like icicles. He doesn't just pull on a pair of socks, he begins wrapping his bare feet in long, jagged strips of rough linen. Then he reaches into a bag and pulls out a handful of dried, springy forest moss. He stuffs the green fibers into his oversized leather boots, packing it tight around his heels and toes until his feet feel like they're encased in a soft, organic nest. But here's the strange part. The moss wasn't just for comfort, it was a high-tech sponge. As his feet sweated or snow leaked in, the moss pulled the moisture away from his skin, acting like a primitive version of modern waterproof gear. And then it gets worse. Once his boots are on, he isn't ready to walk yet. He has to strap on pattens, which are heavy wooden platforms with iron rings bolted to the bottom. What happened next was a strange, clanking walk through the village. These wooden stilts lifted his expensive leather shoes 3 inches off the ground, keeping them out of the freezing, salty slush and animal waste that filled the streets. If a traveler didn't use these platforms, the wet leather of his boots would freeze solid within an hour, turning his shoes into 2 blocks of ice that would slowly crush his feet. In the Middle Ages, walking across the street wasn't just a commute, it was a mechanical engineering project designed to keep you from losing your limbs to the frost. Inside a freezing manor house, a servant stands on a stool, pulling at a pale, stretchy piece of dried pig's bladder. He isn't cleaning, he is stretching the translucent organ across an open wooden window frame and nailing it down tight. He takes a glob of white animal fat and rubs it into the surface, sealing the pores to keep the biting wind from whistling through. But here's the strange part. If you lived in the Middle Ages, your only view of the outside world was through the internal organs of a farm animal. Glass was so expensive that even the wealthy struggled to light their homes. In the next room, a lord peers through a window made of flattened, scraped-down cow horn. It doesn't show the sky, it only lets in a dull, sickly yellow glow that barely illuminates the floor. And then it gets worse. Because these windows were made of skin and bone, they didn't just block the light, they smelled. As the hearth fire heated the room, the pig bladder and greased horn would warm up, filling the air with the faint, oily scent of a butcher shop. What happened next was a choice between light and life. If the bladder tore during a storm, the family had to scramble to wooden shutters and bolt them shut, plunging the entire house into total, suffocating darkness for days. Most peasants simply lived in the dark all winter long, huddled around a fire with no windows at all. It turns out the cozy medieval winter was actually a grim reality of sitting in a dark, smelly box, waiting for the sun to return. A village priest and 2 local men struggle through a white wasteland, their legs sinking into waist-deep snow with every step. They aren't traveling to church, they are staring intensely at a small, thatch-roofed cottage nearly buried by the drifts. The priest points at the chimney, which is cold and quiet, showing no sign of the thin blue smoke that means life. But here's the strange part. In a world without phones, a silent chimney was the only way to signal for help. The men pull heavy wooden shovels from their belts and begin frantically digging at the snow-blocked door. They aren't worried about the family outside. They are terrified of what happened inside while the house was sealed shut. Because the villagers stuffed every crack with mud to keep the heat in, the smoke from the hearth had nowhere to go. And then it gets worse. If the family fell asleep while the fire was smoldering, the silent killer, carbon monoxide, could take them all before they ever woke up. What happened next was a desperate race against the clock. The men finally bashed the door open, the wood groaning against the ice, and a cloud of stale, cold air hits them. They rush inside to find a family huddled under a mountain of wool blankets, their faces pale and their breaths barely visible in the dim light. In the great white silence of a medieval winter, your neighbors were your only safety net. If no one noticed your chimney had gone cold, your home didn't just become a shelter, it became a tomb.